Well, tonight we continue our series that we have titled Stories My Mama Told Me. And somebody ran into me recently and said, man, I saw that title, but I have no idea what it's about. And so I had a little bit of fun making something up. But the reality is that this series is really born out of those of us who've had the privilege of having parents who have raised us in the scriptures. And if you're like me, it was your mom who pulled you aside and just taught you these ancient tales of God's greatness, especially in the Old Testament. And since there's a number of you who are newer to the Bible, we thought what an amazing thing for us to have story time together and to look at some of these instant Old Testament classics together, just to acquaint you with this God who we worship, this God we stand in awe of. But another one of the reasons we wanted to do this series was to remind us all that, listen, from the beginning to the end, from the Old Testament to the New, the Bible has always and ultimately been about the person of Jesus Christ. Even the most striking stories in the Old Testament, the New Testament tells us were all just shadows ultimately pointing us to the fulfillment who is the person of Jesus Christ. As a church that is bent on learning to love Jesus Christ, we know how desperately we need to first see him and first see him in the book in which he's revealed this very Bible. And so a couple of weeks ago, we looked at the Old Testament story of Noah and the ark. Last week, we looked at the story, emotional, intense story of Abraham and his son Isaac. And tonight, we're going to look at the story of Moses, and in particular, Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea, an incredibly famous story. Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea. And really what this story is about is God's miraculous delivery of his people out of slavery and captivity into the land of freedom, into a place of fullness, is really what this story is about. Now, leading up to what we're going to look at, the Israelites have been taken captive in the nation of Egypt. They've been slaves, treated with gruesome brutality for over 400 years. They are forced to work against their will. It even got to a place where the Pharaoh, the king in Egypt, the Pharaoh, put into place a law that said, it was a postnatal abortion law that said every male, every baby boy born in Israel must be executed. The Egyptians hated the Israelites, and their goal was to make life as bitter for them as was humanly possible. And they succeeded over a course of 4 centuries. Needless to say, the misery of the Israelites led them to cry out to God, please don't forget us. You have got to come and rescue us. You have got to come and redeem us from the hand of our oppressors. You've got to come and unshackle these chains, God. Exodus is the story of God's response to his people's plight and what he did to rescue them. So the man we're going to look at, Moses, was born into that environment. Moses was born as a slave into a slave world, and he was born with a bounty on his head. He was born with a death sentence on his head. He was one of the boys who was technically supposed to be executed, but God, through a series of miraculous and almost hilarious events, preserves Moses' life. All right, let me tell you a little bit about it. So Moses, his mom knows he's supposed to die, but she hides him. When Moses gets too old to hide, she says, I'm going to put him in a basket and set him in the Nile and just pray, God, please rescue my boy. It happened that on one particular day, Pharaoh's daughter, the king's daughter, comes to the edge of the Nile, and she finds this basket. Oh, a little baby, I want one. So she says, get one of those slave women to come and look after my little boy. And when he's old enough, and I'm a princess, I don't have time to be feeding a baby, but get somebody to look after the baby for me, and I will pay them to raise this child. So the little girl goes and finds a woman who happens to be Moses' mother, because the little girl was Moses' sister. And through this miraculous series of events, Pharaoh ends up paying for Moses to be raised. Anyway, God miraculously saves Moses, and eventually Pharaoh wants Moses dead, and Moses is on the run. And as Moses is exiled, this self-imposed witness protection program, God shows up and says, hey, Moses, here's the deal. I want you to go back into Egypt. I know you're fugitive on the run, I know. I want you to go back to Egypt. Yeah, I know Grandpa Pharaoh died and now your Uncle Pharaoh's in power and he doesn't like you. But I want you to go back to Egypt so that I can set my people free. So Moses goes back to Egypt, like God says, and he walks into Pharaoh's palace and says, Pharaoh, here's the deal. God wants you to let his people go. Pharaoh has a bit of a laugh. They have a bit of a conversation. Pharaoh's not about to do it. And God told Moses in advance, Pharaoh's not going to want to let my people go. But here's what I want you to do. Still tell him he must let my people go, otherwise I'll bring judgment on his people. Pharaoh's like, I'm not letting these people go. Free labor. And I hate them. Why would I let them go? And so there are a series of 10 judgments, 10 plagues that God sends to Pharaoh to convince him it is a really good idea if you let my people go. Strike one, Pharaoh won't do it. And God sends locusts and frogs and flies, and he turns water into blood, and so there's no drinking source. Darkness comes over Egypt, and Pharaoh just stubbornly says, I'm not letting these people go. Better yet, what Pharaoh would actually do would say, man, this is really bad. I hate these consequences. Okay, I'll let God's people go. And then he would change his mind, say psych, and he would keep them in slavery for a series of years, ignoring God's calling, until God finally gets his attention by killing the firstborn son of every Egyptian. And finally, Pharaoh says, I'm tired of this. We've got to let these people go. Things are getting bad for us. And he agrees to release God's people. Exodus chapter 14, if you would turn there. That's where we're going to spend our time. And we're going to spend our time looking at the story of God's people being delivered out of captivity in Egypt after Pharaoh says, all right, get them out of here, to actually moving towards the land that God is calling them to. Exodus chapter 14. We're going to look at this chapter. We're going to try and take this chapter in sections, and we're going to stop, as always, and draw attention to some principles that we trust the Spirit will be gracious enough to use in our lives here this evening. And I trust you're open to that you are open and hungry for whatever he might have for you, that there's no resistance to whatever the Lord might want to do through his word. So Exodus chapter 14, verse 1, here's what it says. Then the Lord said to Moses, after the people had left, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth. These beautiful names for kids if you're looking. Between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. Verse 4, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. Let's stop there for a second. So here's a gist of what's going on at this particular stage. God explicitly tells Moses to lead his people into a trap. Tell them to camp by the sea, in a valley of sorts, with the desert behind them, the sea in front of them, and rocky mountains closing them in from both sides. Tell them to camp between the sea and the desert. And oh, by the way, Pharaoh is furious and he'll be coming after you from the desert. So, Moses agrees to do this. You have no way of escape when the Pharaoh comes after you. So Moses does. He says, hey, everyone, we're camping on the beach, yay, and everybody sets up camp on the shore of the Red Sea. God, the director of this story, he's gracious, so he lets Moses in on his plan. He lets Moses take a sneak peek at the script, what he has in store for them. And he says, listen, as crazy and suicidal as it may seem, as trapped and boxed in as you guys are going to feel, please know that this is just me setting up the stage to show up in an incredible way. And by the way, some of you may feel like that this evening. You may feel like life or your marriage situation or work has you boxed in. And I just want to tell you, it might be the director setting up for a showing up. Stay tuned. All right, so God says something which I do not want us to miss in verse 4 as we proceed. It is beyond crucial that we set this story and every other story, by the way, including yours, in its right context. Here's what happens. God strategically stacks the odds against himself. He's making it humanly impossible for any escape to take place in this scenario. He is making it feel completely and entirely helpless. Why? Ratings. The ratings, right? He wants the ending. He wants that Jack Bauer moment, the deliverance scene, to be so dramatic that it reverberates through the generations as people ask each other, how did God pull that off so he can up his ratings? Because God's greatest goal is God's greatest glory. We have got to embrace that before we move on. The author of the script is ultimately about his name being magnified and the generations adoring him as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the universe and the galaxy. He is all about his glory. And so he wants to set up a situation that will show off the multiple colors of his greatness. He's about to deliver his people for his glory ratings to be driven through the roof. And he may have you in an impossible situation so that when he delivers you out of the box you feel like you're in, his glory ratings in your life and through your story will skyrocket. It's about his glory. He wants to save the lost and the broken in Warsaw and in Thailand for the sake of his glory. He chooses to love undeserving, broken sinners like us. Ephesians 1 says, for the praise of his glory. Just in case we attempted to think any of the scripts are ultimately about us, verse 4 reminds us this is for his glory. He's about to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Egyptians into freedom for his great glory. It's all about him. It ain't about us. And this story doesn't take its rightful place until we embrace that. It's about his glory. Are you okay with that? Are you a little more okay with that than that? Yeah? Verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. This is a sad and scary scene in the story. The picture of Pharaoh readying his army to go after the Israelites. A sad and scary picture. I mean, how much pain has Pharaoh already experienced because of these people? I mean, how many plagues has the guy experienced because he insists on holding on to these people? What's the count now? 10? His entire country, his family has suffered miserably because he will not let go of these people, and yet here he is suiting up to go after them again. A sad and scary picture. What was the last plague Pharaoh experienced? Say it out loud. The death of his firstborn son. And not only his firstborn son, but the firstborn sons of everyone in Egypt, including, by the way, the animals. All because he continued to hold on to his slaves. And yet here he is going after them again. A sad and scary scene. Pharaoh wakes up and somebody tells him, hey, the Israelites actually left. And Pharaoh's immediate response is, we have lost their services. We have lost their services. And my immediate response is, Pharaoh, you have lost your son. But he continues to go after them. He leaves his wife and his family at the funeral of his son to go back after these people who've already cost him so much. A sad and scary picture. And it's in this scene that the tragic irony becomes painfully clear to us. The master is actually a slave. In fact, I suggest that this slave master Pharaoh is more enslaved than the Israelites had been for 400 years. Because if the Israelites could have, they would have left. And yet Pharaoh, even at the cost of his own son, won't let this go. Because he can't. He's a slave. When you can't live without something, even though it has cost you more than you would ever have rationally paid for it, you might be a slave. When God has fired 10 holy warning shots, and you are still going after the thing he has warned you about, you might be a slave. When you know you're losing your relationship with your kids, but you've got to continue to climb the corporate ladder and just make a few more thousand so you can meet your financial goal, you might be a slave. When she tells you she'll leave you if you continue to use porn, but you still run after it, you might be a slave. When the doctors have told you for the 10th time, the alcohol will shut down your body, but you can't stop drinking it, you may not be as mastery as you have always thought. You might be a slave. And when your grades are suffering because you can't get off of social media, you might be a slave. Facebook might not be as taboo a master, I'm saying, but you might be a slave. And when the threat of foreclosure is near and you continue with that online poker gambling business, you might be a slave. When you know you might go back in for that parole violation, but you continue to do the same thing, you might be a slave. When your heart is turning black because you just won't forgive that person who hurt you, you might be a slave. And the thing you thought you owned actually owns you. A sad and scary picture. And oh, by the way, when consequences are not enough, you're definitely a slave. And as was true for Pharaoh, consequences are never enough when you're enslaved to sin. He got caught 10 times, and he just continued to do it. Now, he had a little bit of regret repentance, but never righteous remorse repentance. Because when the consequences wore off, he went back after the very thing that had him in this place to begin with. He suffered painful consequences, but when the sting wore off, he went back. When the pain of consequences wears off and you run back in to the thing God has said, do not do, you might be a slave. And some of us are there tonight. Now, we don't wear slave garb. We don't have t-shirts that announce our slavery. But loss and consequence has been our portion, and yet we still insist on making preparations to go after the thing we know is sin. And the question is, are you going to kill it, or is it going to kill you? And in this section of scripture, here's the scary thing. It says that God hardens and judges Pharaoh. And the idea here is God will actively harden and judge the person who insists on a course of resistance. Romans 1 talks about people who traded natural sexual relations for unnatural, and they traded the truth for a lie. And eventually God said, enough. I am going to hand you over to your own passions. I am done. And when God does that, judgment comes next. And that's happened to Pharaoh. Because listen, not even rock bottom is enough in some situations. Because I'm just saying, if I lose my son, that should qualify as rock bottom. And if it doesn't, I may not only be a slave, but I may be in the hardening and judgment phase of my slavery. It says God hardens his heart. And again, some of us may be on warning number 4. And if we continue, God will harden the heart. And as we're going to see in a little bit, when he does that, it can often be too late. Verse 9. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, you don't say, and cried out to the Lord. So the Israelites are on the beach, sunbathing and dreaming about all the future possibilities in freedom land when suddenly, the language is suddenly, without warning, the most powerful army on the planet, the army that has kept them enslaved for 4 centuries under their oppressive thumb, is closing in from behind them fast. They were terrified. It makes sense to me. Post-traumatic stress starts to set in. Reliving the years of torture starts to resurface. This would have been a paralyzing sight to see your worst fear coming from behind you while you are trapped in a box. There is national panic. And obviously the mentality of the Israelites is, listen, we are either going to die here or we're going to wish we died here. Pharaoh hated us enough as it was. Now he has lost his firstborn son because of us. This is a scary sight as the short-lived songs of freedom turn to cries of terror. And so what's the natural response? Schizophrenia. Oh, God, help us. Moses, you're a jerk. They turn on Moses, right? Verse 11, they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt? By the way, this is scathing, this little speech they give him. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you, we told you, Moses, in Egypt, leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians, as slaves, by the way, than to die in the desert. Moses, you are going to let us start to fall in love with this idea of freedom, starting to taste the crisp air of better, only to have our dreams snatched up in the desert in a moment. The only thing worse than dying, in fact, the only thing worse than dying as a slave is dying almost free, with freedom in your view. This is cruel, and you are to blame, Moses. And it's true with all of us. When fear sets in, it induces amnesia, and it happens to them. They completely forget the amazing ways in which God has already provided for them. Fear will do that. And just like Pharaoh, which is ironic, the Israelites forget the 10 shots of hope that God demonstrated in the plagues that he sent. Not to mention, at this point in their journey, God is leading them by a cloud pillar during the day and a pillar of fire by night. And at this point, the pillar that represents the presence of God is parked right in front of them. And fear makes them forget that in an instant. Isn't it amazing how quickly fear makes us forget the promises of God and makes us undermine the provision of God and makes us ignore the very presence of God? And even worse, when fear is allowed to set in, and this is the picture we see with the Israelites, it will often choose familiarity over freedom. Fear will do that to you. It will begin to believe slavery wasn't so bad after all. At least we knew what to expect. Slavery was better. At least we knew what the next day held. Slavery was better. It was bondage, sure, but at least the chains were familiar. Yet the relationship was sinful and it was abusive, but at least it was familiar. I think it was better back there. Fear will do that. My parents' home was a place of control and condescension, but at least I had a bed. It was better back there. It may not have been what God wanted for my life, but at least it was predictable. Yeah, I mean, the alcohol, the drugs, they were killing me, but they were better than the possibility of rejection in real life relationships. Fear will make us start to long for the familiar because it's better than the unknown. And we'll start to look back and long for our chains. Fear makes the Israelites forget the promises and long for familiarity. We'll come back to that. Verse 13. So Moses answers this panic, and he says, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see," I love this, "today, you would never see them again." Somebody just say amen. Amen. Thank you. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Stop freaking out, everybody. Time out, time out. Stop your panicking. God's got this. Take your eyes off the Egyptians and look at the cloud. Your God is about to go to work. It's not your battle, it's the Lord's. And so he says to them, stand your ground. Such an important word, especially where fear is present. Stand your ground. Don't let fear win. Don't be tempted to go back to the familiar just because you knew it. Stand your ground. Stand on what the Lord said to you last. Stand your ground. Because, by the way, familiar slavery is never better than even the most unfamiliar freedom, ever. Stand your ground. It's the only way you ever get front row seats of God fighting for you, is when you stand your ground and you stay where he told you and you move in the direction that he said, even though it's risky, even though it's scary. And so in this particular scene, it's decision time for the people of God. They will either retreat in fear or they'll proceed in faith. They'll either go into the unfamiliar of the promises or they'll retreat to the familiar of slavery. That happens to all of us at some point or another, between the fearful familiar of the past and the unsettling unknown of where God may be leading us, especially where a threat is looming to end us. Will you stand your ground or will you retreat? Moses gives them this calling, stand your ground. And as we saw last week with Abraham's story, that's true here. You will never see the miraculous delivery of God. You will never see his greatest, most impressive provision for you unless you stand your ground. If the Israelites had turned back to the familiar, they would never have seen what was about to happen. They would have just returned to the shackles of the past if they had retreated to the familiar. And I don't know, but I want to see God fight. I want to see how he throws a punch. I want to see how he knocks out the enemies. But the only way for me to do that is for me to stand my ground, even when fear comes looming. And even when the future is uncertain, except that God has said, move this way, go in this direction. But we'll see God's about to pick a fight. Exodus 14:15 says this. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying? Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. God says to Moses, hey, your prayers have been answered. It's now time to act. And by the way, this isn't a rebuke. God isn't saying, like, stop your crying, like crying is inappropriate. God is just saying, listen, it's time. Your prayers are going to be answered. Here's what I want you to do next. Tell the people to move on. And Moses is like, move where? God's like, I thought you might ask that. Well, okay, well, let's do this, Moses. If it's all the same with you, lift that stick thingamajiggy that you have in your hand, that you've been carrying, stretch it over the water thing, and I'll go ahead and, split it, and then 500,000 plus of people will walk right through on dry ground. Okay? Oh, this God of ours. If he doesn't deserve the glory, who does? This is insane what we're about to see happen here. How many of you would have guessed that was coming next? Be honest. If you had never read this story before, you didn't know Bruce Willis was dead in The Sixth Sense. You would never have guessed this. I'm just saying. This is unbelievable. God is about to split a sea in half, y'all. In half. A sea. Come on. We read this too often and we become familiar, like, the sea thing. And by the way, some of you need to be reminded that after you've stood your ground, he will split your sea. Some of you need to dance in that truth for a little bit because you've waited for a long time for God to come through on something he led you to do. You stood in that marriage. He's going to split your sea. You refuse to sleep with that guy, and he's going to show up. He always does. You wouldn't cut corners on that business deal, and everybody else seems to have moved forward except you. He's going to split that sea. You've put your house on the market feeling called to Arizona. He's going to split that sea, y'all. And I hope you like math because God's about to do some long division for you. Watch this, right? I know. Sometimes I say, don't say it, and then it's said, it's too late. You stand your ground, and he will split your sea. And some of you have no idea how you're going to get out of the box you're in. And I'm saying, stand your ground and watch the deliverance of the Lord. It's not your fight. He's got this. Verse 17, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory. Ratings through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians, verse 18, will know that I am the Lord. When I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now the Egyptians are going to come after you, but the glory will be mine. It's about to be on. Verse 19. Then the angel of the Lord, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of clouds also moved from in front and stood behind them. Wow. Coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. And throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side, that's the Egyptian side, and light to the other side. the Israelites' side, so neither went near the other all night. And so as the Egyptians approach the Israelites to take them over, the cloud, which represents the presence of God, just swings and goes behind them and creates a buffer between God's people and their enemies. A beautiful picture. And throughout the night, the cloud brought utter darkness for the Egyptians. They couldn't see anything, and yet on the other side of the cloud was sheer light. So the Israelites could see, and it was day all night for God's people as he lit up the way to freedom. Verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea with that stick thingy, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. This is that famous scene where God splits the Red Sea in two. Crazy. And again, don't sit there and act all cute and cool and rob God of his glory like we've seen anything like this before, or we've seen anything like this since he deserves praise. He parted a sea. He made a holy aquarium through the Red Sea on both sides as water stood up as still as glass. As sharks looked at the people in utter confusion, no idea what's going on. And the Israelites march through this hydro tunnel into freedom on the ground of the sea. Because after you've stood your ground, man, the view gets ridiculous. You cannot predict how God will make good on his promise. No one would have guessed this for the Israelites, and we can't guess how he's going to do it for you. But stand your ground and stay tuned. An incredible scene. The sea is split. Verse 23. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. Again, a tragic picture, because at this point, the Egyptians are fully into the judgment phase. The grace phase is over. It's now time for judgment. There comes a time when God stops warning you and God stops providing grace and he gives us over to the things we've insisted on running after. Then we fall into his hands in judgment. The worst kind of judgment. Exodus 14:24. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire. What a picture. And the cloud at the Egyptian army, and he threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." A little too late. Listen, when a dark cloud is standing straight up, that might be a good time to say, listen, the smoke monster thingy is a little too much for us. Maybe this isn't a good idea. Let's go back. But even then, they persisted. When the sea splits and you're still running into the water after these people, you are now in the judgment phase, a hardening of the heart. And God finally puts an end to the Egyptians. The Egyptians have been staring at God's grace in the form of warnings, and they just won't take them. And by the way, you never want to get there. And the fact that you're here tonight means the era of grace is still alive and well. The opportunity to turn is still real and available to you. But you have no idea how long that is going to last if you persist in the direction of rebellion against God. He has shown you too many opportunities and given you too much grace for you not to capitalize and make the most of it. For some of us, tonight may be the last time we have an opportunity to turn. Verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back into its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And then this last phrase, "And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore." Make no mistake about it, this is a gory, gruesome scene. God crushes the Egyptians. God destroys these people. He drives them into the ground on the bottom of the sea and viciously extinguishes their lives and causes the water to go over them. Moses portrays this picture so vividly, so violently, that there's little left to the imagination. They are swallowed up by the water, and the same sea that brought freedom for the Israelites brought death for the Egyptians. God has extinguished this army, and Egypt was never the most powerful nation in the world again. Not only that, God waits until the sun comes up before he tells Moses, "Tell the waters to close in over them," so that the Israelites can witness this gruesome, gory scene with their own eyes, so they can see what's happening to their oppressors. In fact, God then makes sure that some of the bodies of the Egyptians wash up onto the shore at the feet of the Israelites in this R-rated, really gruesome picture of judgment. Don't miss the gruesome nature of the judgment of God when it comes. It's not pretty. We can try and sugarcoat it if we want, or make him out to be only loving, but the reality is God will crush oppressors. God will crush those who oppose him. Gruesome. But don't miss the beauty of this. This is beautiful. Don't miss this. God closes the sea over the oppressors. In this violent, brutal, gruesome, crushing scene, God covers over the Egyptians. Why? Because he wants the Israelites to know your bondage is gone. You are free. He wants them to know your master is dead. He no longer has power over you. Your past is at the bottom of the sea. You never have to fear it again. You can live in freedom. You can sleep through the night. You can march into the land of promise. And if anyone reminds you of what you used to be, you remind them of what you saw with your own eyes. God wanted them to make no mistake, your past is gone. Your chains are gone. You have been set free. An amazing picture of the beauty of God's deliverance. You no longer have to give in to that sin. You are free. You don't have to live as a slave to anything. Who the Son sets free is what? Free indeed. You don't have to be subject to your past. The only way your past has power over you is when you bend over and lean over one of those corpses of the dead Egyptians and CPR them back to life. The only way your past has power is when you start to create channels back to where you used to be, because as far as God is concerned, your past is gone. Your chains are broken. And some of us have walked out of bondage, but we've left the door cracked. We've kept one more contact number. We've got a stash somewhere just in case. We've still got the premium channels that have held us in captivity. We still have connections to our bondage, buddies we used to drink with. Close the sea. God already did. Close off the channels to your bondage and to your past and walk in freedom. Because here's the reality. Just because God sets you free doesn't mean you're living like it. But the only way you don't is when you CPR corpses and when you make channels into your past. Because as far as he's concerned, the light was shining bright. You saw what happened to your past. Verse 31, the last verse. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord. Jason, I'm going to have you come up. And we'll let people go if they need to, but we'll close in a song and celebrate the greatness of this God of ours. When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in Moses, his servant. And the ratings went up. God got the glory. People were impressed with him. Let me read a passage of scripture here as we close. This is Luke chapter 4. And I'm going to start reading at verse 16. And here's what it says. He, Jesus, went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, the year of the Lord's grace." Then, verse 20, he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus admits to these listeners, listen, I am the ultimate bondage breaker. I am the ultimate chain crusher. I am the ultimate way maker. I am the champion of freedom. I'm the one who saw a people enslaved and came down to offer my body. My body was split so that those who were previously enslaved could walk not through a Red Sea, but through my red blood into a place of freedom. On the cross, I crushed sin and death and every other oppressor that has held you captive for years so that you can live freely in me. I have come to set the captive free. Anyone who's tired of their shackles, anyone who longs to be free, I came to offer that freedom to them. And that is true for us tonight. This was just a picture pointing to the ultimate freedom that Jesus brings. Guys, feel free to get started. And so tonight we want to do that, even as we sing this song. You may be Pharaoh. You may be completely obsessed with something that you're holding on to and refusing to let it go. And tonight is a night to release it to him while the year of favor is still upon us. And for some of us, we may be those slaves who have been enslaved to whatever sin it is, maybe for 40 years. I want to remind you, after 400 years, he still set the captives free. And tonight is the night that you say, I am laying down my chains and I'm going to the offer of freedom that is in the person of Jesus Christ. And maybe some of us have been set free, but we're still keeping connections to the things that enslaved us. And tonight's the night where we say, I am done. I'm releasing this. I'm relinquishing it. I want to walk in freedom. I want the views that are on the way to the place God is calling me to. And if you fall in any of those categories, even as we sing this song together, declaring he is stronger than our chains, he is stronger than our captivity, that you would embrace this and own this and lay your chains at his feet. And boy, raise your hands and worship him. He deserves the glory and he alone. But I trust no one will walk out of here holding on to chains or holding on to guilt or holding on to the past. He is stronger than all of those things. Jesus Christ, the chain crusher. So let's stand together. Let's worship him. And again, if you need to kneel, feel free to do that. If you want to raise your hands, feel free to do that. If you want to shout, feel free to do that. He's so deserving of it. Let's worship him together.